So I'd like to welcome everyone to this virtual press briefing for the high-level pledging event for the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. My name is Melissa Fleming, and I'm the Undersecretary General for Global Communications at the United Nations. This briefing follows today's pledging conference. A total of $1.35 billion in pledges has been announced from a wide range of donors to the humanitarian response in Yemen, including to fight COVID-19. As you know, the United Nations has been sounding the alarm about the plight of women, children, displaced, and other vulnerable people in Yemen. Our thanks to the media for covering this critical situation. What was already the world's largest humanitarian crisis has only been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, pushing Yemen to the brink of an unimaginable disaster. A pledging event like today could therefore hardly have been more urgent or necessary. The pledges, when paid, will literally mean the difference between life and death for countless Yemenis, including many children. And I note Mark Lowcock's call to have those pledges paid soon because of this urgent situation for so many Yemeni people. The largest funder of the humanitarian response in Yemen in recent years has been the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the United Nations is pleased to have co-hosted this event with you. Let me now introduce our participants in this briefing. In Riyadh, we have His Excellency Dr. Abdullah Rabeeah, the advisor to the Royal Court and Supervisor General of the King Salman Humanitarian Aid and Relief Center. And in London, we have Mr. Mark Lowcock, Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and the UN Relief Coordinator. For technical reasons, dear journalists, we cannot take your questions in real time, but we have received your questions in advance by email, and I will put those questions to our two participants. But before we go to the first question, I'd like to ask both His Excellency Dr. Abdullah Rabeeah and the Undersecretary General Mark Lowcock to give, please, your immediate reaction to today's conference. Dr. Rabeeah, over the floor to you.
Thank you, Melissa. I think for me, I leave this conference with a positive attitude. I think this is the first ever held a virtual conference for pledging at this magnitude. And Saudi Arabia is happy to partner with the UN in this conference. Though the pledging did not match last year's numbers, but to me, I think it's a very good actually response, taking in consideration many factors. As we all know, there is a COVID-19 effect on the world, and also the economic crisis resulted from it. There are also worries that I have mentioned in my speech by some of the donor countries about some of the violations against humanitarian aid. But in spite of that, I think we have received a very good response. More importantly, the number and level of attendance, to me, it's a positive in this conference. And I think the remarks that we have heard from all of the speakers that everybody is calling for a political solution. Everybody is calling for supporting Yemen. Everybody is calling to work hard to coordinate the work to fight COVID-19 in Yemen. Those points taken together, if we coordinate them and also continue to advocate for them, we are not far from reaching a better future for Yemen. So my last comment that let's work hard to continue the pressure on a political solution. And I can assure you Saudi Arabia will give it the full support, and the UN, of course. And also we should continue till the end of the year calling for donor countries, as Mark mentioned, to continue their support to Yemen, because they need our help, they need our dedication, and they need our care. And lastly, this experience to me is a success thanks to the UN and their teams, and Mark in particular and his team. And I thank also my team from Saudi Arabia. And it could be the beginning of a successful future for our meetings virtually. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rabeeah. And I'd like now to pass the floor to Mark Lowcock. Mark, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Melissa. Thanks for joining everybody. I'd like to start by expressing my deep personal thanks to my friend, Dr. Abdullah, for the collaboration we've had with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and him and his team in particular, in putting on what is an unusual event. These pledging conferences, of course, happen a lot, but to do it virtually in this way is a new challenge, a challenge we've been required to rise to because of the realities of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have had good participation in today's conference, and we have had a wide discussion of all the issues which are generating the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, the ongoing conflict, the particular impact of COVID-19, and of course all the restrictions that have been put in place by too many of the parties inside Yemen, which have made the work of humanitarian agencies much harder than it needs to be. But inevitably, because this is a pledging conference, the purpose of which is to raise money for the relief operation to continue, the main focus has been on the financial position. And the Prime Minister of Yemen gave us a very important introduction in describing the grave state of the position in his country when he told us that Yemen, in Yemen now, a macabre tragedy is imminent. And many of the aid agencies, the UN agencies and the NGOs and others, corroborated and reiterated that when they told us about the scale of the funding challenge they are facing. They told us about shortage of cash and programs having to be closed imminently. So that was the backdrop to the discussion we had about the funds we need to keep those life-saving programs going. Now, I'll describe to you the outcome in terms of pledges, but just to provide you with some context, let me tell you that last year, for its humanitarian response, the United Nations raised $3.2 billion over the course of the year. That was why we were able in Yemen to reach 13 million people a month in what was the world's largest humanitarian relief operation, which unquestionably saved millions of lives. As of now, 5 months into 2020, we've so far raised something less than $500 million. So much less than we'd raised at this time last year. And that's why the pledging conference was important today, to give us a chance to catch up with that. Now, we had a pledging conference last year in Geneva, and on that day, we raised $2.6 billion. And that was why we were able, by the end of the year, to have brought in a total of $3.2 billion. So we had a very successful pledging conference last year. Now, the position we have today is that we've received pledges of $1.35 billion. So about half what we got in pledges last year. There are some details we need to understand about those pledges, the extent to which they are all for the UN Coordinated Humanitarian Response Plan. But we've so far raised in pledges about half the money that we raised at the pledging conference last year. So what do I conclude from this? Well, the first thing I conclude is that it's extremely important that everybody who has pledged pays promptly, pays immediately, because otherwise these life-saving programs, as all the aid agencies said, will simply close. Secondly, it is important that those who have not pledged this year but did last year, who include some very major donors in the past, it is important that they stand up and play their part in this response effort to save millions of lives. So the United Nations will, picking up a point Abdullah has made, we will continue our fundraising efforts. We cannot be satisfied with where we've got to today. We have to keep going, because unless we raise more resources, we will face a horrific outcome by the end of the year. The United Nations will not abandon the people of Yemen. We will stand with the people of Yemen, and we will call on the world to stand behind the people of Yemen. What's needed in Yemen is peace, but in the meantime, we have to keep people alive, and that's what the humanitarian operation needs to do. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you, Mark, for that powerful statement. What's needed is peace, but in the meantime, we have to keep people alive. Yes, this is a good segue, I think, into the questions. Our first question is for Dr. Rabeeah. It's from Al-Shaq Al-Awsat, and it is, how will the results of this conference and the contributions made by donor countries alleviate the suffering of the Yemeni people?
Well, Melissa, thank you. There is no question that, as Mark closed his statements, that we have to keep people alive, and I'll add to that, we have to keep people alive and healthy also. And the pledges that has been made today will help to keep the momentum of the major humanitarian work that's happening on the ground by the UN agencies and also by the international organizations and NGOs and local NGOs in Yemen. Yes, it's half of the money, but it's important to keep the work going. There are many children who need food. There are many people who need also to save their lives in the health system of Yemen. We have also to fight COVID-19. So we hope that the money that has been pledged will actually, as Mark mentioned, will be channeled through the system of those targeted organizations which will implement the work as rapidly as it can be. Also, we hope that hindrances and limitations of both humanitarian workers and the aid itself will be limited and minimized. It's about time for to those who actually violate the international law to stop and allow for the UN and the international community working in the humanitarian side to save lives, and any actually hindrance and obstruction is actually a cost of a human life. So we should not allow this to happen, and we should be vocal about it. We should not shy from bringing this to the media. We should not shy from bringing this to the UN system. It's enough for those violations and enough for selling the life of the Yemeni people for a political motive.
Thank you very much. I think a follow-up question related from Mecca News. Will the donor conference for Yemen be held periodically until the country emerges from its crisis? Do you want to comment on that, Dr. Rabeeah?
Well, probably Mark will comment more than me, but I can tell you, if the question is directed to Saudi Arabia, as you know, Saudi Arabia will continue to support Yemen, will continue to support all the actions and initiatives to hold pledging conferences to Yemen. We have been doing that before the conflict. We will continue to do it within the conflict, and hopefully sooner than later after the stability of Yemen. But Melissa, let me maybe add to this. We want to see peace today before tomorrow. We should work hard to reach peace. I think I will call upon the UN, led by the Secretary General and Mark, and also the major actually members of the UN system to stand firm for this call. Saudi Arabia has supported the political solution. There are actually 3 initiatives for political solutions, and added by the initiatives of the UN envoy to Yemen. If we do not become firm next year we'll be meeting here with less interest from the donors. So let's be firm to bring a political solution. And then Saudi Arabia has mentioned it many times. Saudi Arabia will take the initiatives with the UN and other players to move from pledging humanitarian conference to probably pledging for development conference, which what Yemen and its people need. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now a few questions for Mark Lowcock. The first one, I'm going to ask them in a group of three because they're related, and then you could provide one comprehensive answer. The first question is from Al Riyadh newspaper. How can the UN ensure that the aid reaches the beneficiaries in all of Yemen? And from Yemen TV, will all areas, including in the north, receive support from this donor conference? And from the Bahrain news agency, how do you distribute aid in Aden? Mark.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Melissa. The United Nations works in all 333 districts in Yemen, and we have thousands of aid workers there who risk their lives, some in fact losing their lives at the moment, including through COVID, to bring assistance to the most vulnerable of their fellow citizens, alongside hundreds of international aid workers as well. So we absolutely are committed to reaching people in need based entirely and only on levels of need, independently and impartially in every corner of the country. And that is what that's what we do. And we're able, using sophisticated modern techniques, to keep in touch with people around the country to find out whether the aid they're supposed to be getting is in fact getting through to them. We contact people to find out if they've had the food or the health services that they were supposed to get. And when there's a problem, we investigate and then we try and fix the problems. We absolutely work in Aden. The United Nations has a big team in Aden, including people from my own office, as we have teams in many parts of the country. But our fundamental approach is we will reach out and seek and find and support people in need wherever they are in the country, whoever is in charge in that part of the country, on the basis of humanity and in order to save lives independently and impartially.
Thank you very much, Mark. And now I have a couple of questions for Dr. Rabeeah that are similar. So we've grouped this one together. One is from the Al-Masharik news website and the Al Riyadh newspaper, and they're asking, are there any guarantees that the pledges will not reach the hands of armed groups, especially the Houthis?
Well, Melissa, the immediate answer, no. Nobody can guarantee anything. However, saying this, I think the determination of the UN and also the donor countries that we will do what it takes to protect those donations. I think we are escalating on the monitoring system, third-party monitoring. We are also, as I mentioned earlier, we should be vocal about those violations. We should bring them to the attention of the international community. We should also make it clear on the Security Council that those violations are happening from this side or that side. And also we should be very careful in selecting the executing agencies. I'm talking about the subcontracted local agencies that as much credible as possible. We know there are credible Yemeni NGOs that have the capability to have special routes and reach those who are in need, and we should capitalize on those. So we'll do what it takes to minimize those violations, but violations in conflicts will continue. This happens in Yemen and other parts of the world. Our duty is to make them as low as possible.
Thank you very much. I now have a question for Mark Lowcock from DevEx International. How much of the funding pledged today is new funding and not money that has been previously announced and not yet delivered? And do you expect that there could be a lag in receiving funding?
Well, I think most of the money pledged today was money we hadn't heard of before. of course, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia announced a couple of months ago that they would be looking at a pledge of $500 million, which Dr. Abdullah confirmed today. Everything that was pledged today is yet to be paid. So the 1.35 billion I talked about earlier, obviously it now needs to be paid. And the length of time between pledge and payment varies quite a lot between donors. Our plea is for there not to be a gap between pledge and payment, because we've never at this stage of the year in Yemen, while we've had this big humanitarian crisis, we've never had so little money. And that's why agencies are closing their programs right now. They're not closing their programs because the situation is getting better. The situation is getting worse. They're closing their programs because they have no more money. And that was one of our biggest messages today to all of the donors. Don't just pledge, pay promptly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Dr. Rabeeah, there's a question from the Hona news agency from Iraq. Will the grants pledged at the donors conference be in-kind grants, such as food and health items, or will they be in the form of projects for infrastructure, especially towards health facilities? And will there be similar pledging conferences by Saudi Arabia for other countries?
Thank you, Melissa. Well, first of all, the pledging conference today and the money, which has been mentioned already, is for projects to be implemented by UN agencies and international agencies. And this means money that will be injected into specific projects according to the HRP 2020. So all of us are following the HRP, and we trust the UN system. Now, let me clarify also that Saudi Arabia, in addition to what has been pledged today, will continue. We have done this in the last 5 years. This is not the only money that we will inject in Yemen. We will continue in-kind support. As we speak, we are supporting the health system in Yemen with to fight COVID-19 with ventilators, with also diagnostic tools, with equipment, with PPEs. And we have also supported many health hospitals and health centers in Yemen directly by equipment that we move from Riyadh or any city in Saudi Arabia to support the health system in Yemen. The same applies for food items that we carry. So those in-kind donations are additional to the pledges that we talk about it. And I'm sure if you look at our records in the FTS system, you will find that usually there is at least 50% what's being pledged, an additional amount, either in kind or additional money that is injected in the rest of the year. So I will not be surprised that by the end of this year, the 500 will be increased significantly by either in kind or a project that we finance. So this is for the first question. For the second question, Saudi Arabia has always supported pledging conferences, not only in Yemen. We have supported pledging conferences for Syria, for Iraq, for the actually last year we were a co-chair for the Rohingya pledging conference at the UN headquarters. So we will continue to be a co-host. We will be honored to be a partner with the UN in any pledging conference that happens. And not only we are an important member of the UN system, but also we feel that the UN is a significant partner when it comes to humanitarian work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a question for Mark Lowcock from Rast News in Egypt. Will the funds be allocated to support the national economy and to boost the Yemeni rial?
Well, the United Nations Humanitarian Response Plan is not aiming directly to do those things. There are other ways that the international community supports those objectives, including through the leadership role played by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, who have provided foreign exchange to the Central Bank of Yemen amounting to about $1 billion in the last couple of years. And that's been absolutely central to ensuring that the Yemeni rial remains stable. That's very important, because if the real depreciates in the way that it did for large parts of 2018, that directly leads to big increases in the price of food. And larger numbers of people can't afford food, and then the only recourse they have for survival is to the UN Humanitarian Response Programme. In other words, they come to us for food when they can't afford to buy it themselves. Now, I know that there's discussions ongoing all the time about whether Yemen needs more of that kind of support. And I know it's a topic that the Prime Minister of Yemen, who is with us today, is very focused on. And from the UN's point of view, what we want is to move beyond this humanitarian response. It's not a success measure for us to have to run these huge humanitarian operations. We want the country to move forward. The single most important thing to make that possible is, as Abdullah has said, peace. There is a chance now of moving towards peace, and that chance needs to be seized after more than 5 years of a horrible war. And then there will be an opportunity which the international community will need to support Yemen in taking, in rebuilding the economy and supporting national livelihoods and reducing the number of people who need humanitarian assistance. That's what the United Nations would like to see. It's not our objective to have to provide food assistance for 13 million people a month. We only do that because if we didn't do that, those people would not survive. But we want Yemen to move forward, to get out of this crisis, and for people to be able to sustain themselves. And rebuilding the national economy, as intimated in the question, is a fundamental requirement for that. Thank you.
I think, Mark, that's very related to a question by ARD, the German public radio, from their studio in Cairo. Helping Yemenis with humanitarian needs is one thing, but what else could be done to better their lives? I think you addressed it just now a bit, but if there's anything more you'd like to say to that.
Well, it's really the things I've just said, Melissa. The first thing we need is peace, as Abdullah has said repeatedly. And our colleague in the United Nations, Martin Griffiths, is working very, very hard, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to try to find a formula which all the parties can get behind to move the peace forward. From peace, everything else can follow, including the rebuilding of the economy. And then we'll be able to reduce the number of people who can only survive with humanitarian assistance. And maybe one day, not too many years from now, we won't need these pledging conferences anymore. And from my point of view, that will be a success. That's what we're trying to achieve. But in the meantime, we're not willing simply to abandon people who won't survive unless they get humanitarian assistance. We will stand by those people.
Well, that is linked also to another question from an Iraqi news website, Al-Masharaq, to you again. In your opinion, will the donor countries be able to fulfill their obligations in light of the negative repercussions of the corona pandemic and the fragility of the economy around the world?
Well, one of the things we do through my office whenever we do these pledging conferences is we record and publish on our website not just the pledges, but whether and when the pledges are paid. And it's completely transparent to everybody in the world. If a country makes a pledge, it's completely transparent whether they fulfill that pledge or not. Now, it used to be the case before we had this transparent system that too many countries would come to conferences like this one and announce money and never pay it, and people would never see that they hadn't kept their promise. Everybody now can see whether promises are kept or not. And one beneficial effect of that is that a much larger proportion of promises are kept now. More than 90%, in fact, last year of what got pledged was paid. Not all of it as fast as we would have liked, but it was all paid. 90% of it was paid. And my expectation is that countries will continue to do that. You know, this investment is an investment in self-interest as well as humanity. It's not in the interest of neighbouring countries or the wider world for there to be a horrific tragedy in Yemen or in other countries with humanitarian problems, because the consequences of that would be long-lasting and far-reaching. So these pledging conferences are about human empathy and a human response, but they're also an opportunity for countries to recognize their national interest. And the coronavirus is a great example of that. No one will be safe from the coronavirus in any corner of the world until everybody is safe from it in every corner of the world. So we have to help countries wherever they are deal with this pandemic.
Okay, Mark, a final question before we come to the end of this press conference, and those of you whose questions I've not been able to get to, my OCHA colleagues will be providing you answers over email. This is from the New York Times, and it's for you, Mark. You said in early April that Saudi Arabia had pledged $500 million for Yemen humanitarian relief, but last week you said that the money had not been dispersed. Has that money been dispersed yet? And is it part of what Saudi Arabia has pledged at today's event?
Well, maybe it's more appropriate for Abdullah to reply to that than for me to reply.
Probably, yes. My notes said that this was directed to you, but I agree. Dr. Abdullah would. Well, Dr. Abdullah.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Melissa. Well, when Saudi Arabia announced the commitment before, that meant that it will be announced in the pledging conference, which was materialized today. And as I have mentioned in my clear speech, that the 500 million will be to the HRB. 2/3 of it, or 300 million, will go through the UN agencies, and 200 will go with the international agencies or regional agencies. So the money will be channeled, will be signed in contracts. We already started the discussions, and as I can tell you that Saudi Arabia will start as early as tomorrow to discuss with the UN and non-UN agencies to sign the contracts and disperse the money. But let me add to this. Saudi Arabia is also concerned, such as I'm sure it's the same as all donor countries. We are really concerned with what's happening on those violations, and we have seen, I'm sure Melissa and Mark have seen pictures in the media and videos that ambulances with the UN agencies logos and other agencies logos being taken as a frontline fighter cars. So we want to ensure that the same determination and dedication in the UN and in the international community, we want to be sure that we will have the necessary steps to ensure that there is enough monitoring and hindrance to avoid those violations. But I can assure you Saudi Arabia will pass on the money, but we want to be assured that the money will go to those who are in need to maximize the impact of the money on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rabeeah, for that clarification, and thank you to the journalists who submitted questions. And again, apologies for not getting to all of them due to the constraints of time. But now we've come to the end of this press briefing, and I would like to thank everyone for joining us online today. Again, journalists, thank you for continuing to cover the acute humanitarian situation in Yemen. And I wish everyone safety and good health wherever you are.